All right, well, it's wonderful to be here with you all today, if virtually, and thank you for having me. My name is Sam Myers. I'm a research scientist at the Harvard School of Public Health and the director of the Planetary Health Alliance, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about planetary health, which really fundamentally is about seeing human health globally as an ecosystem service. And the field of planetary health has really emerged out of what I think is a unique moment in human history. By many accounts, there's never been a better time to be a human being. The last 75 years or so has seen really extraordinary improvements in human development. In the last 75 years or so, the number of adult people around the world who can read and write has more than doubled. The number of people who were living in extreme poverty in 1950 was 1.6 billion people, with only 920 million people not in extreme poverty. And 65 years later, there are 730 million people living in extreme poverty and 6.6 billion people not in extreme poverty. In other words, in that 65-year period, the percentage of the population living in extreme poverty dropped from 62% to around 10%. Human health has also been improving pretty dramatically. Life expectancy has gone up from 46 to an average of 72 over that same period. And child mortality has dropped by really essentially a factor of 4. But the same, really extraordinary scientific and technological developments that have fueled these exceptional improvements in education, wealth, and health over really just one person's lifetime have also been driving this extraordinary expansion of humanity's total ecological footprint, of the sum effect of our activities on our planet's natural systems. And if you look at human consumption over time, whether you're looking at appropriation of water resources, proliferation of cars and trucks, production and use of synthetic fertilizers, paper production, plastic production, or primary energy use, you see these very similar curves where there is relatively modest global consumption patterns up until about 1950, and then this very steep, almost exponential increase in the scale of human consumption over time. And not surprisingly, if you look at our impacts across our planet's natural systems, you see similar patterns with really accelerating losses of biodiversity, exploitation of fisheries, addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, ocean acidification, and loss of tropical and indeed temperate forests. And the reason that all of these trends look so similar is that they're all underlain by two, really fundamental trends. And the first is the growth in the human population, which was actually pretty steady for most of human history. And then around 1900, it started a gentle rise. And around 1950, you see this very, very rapid increase in the number of people who share the planet with us. And during that same period of time, we see this even steeper increase in per capita GDP, and the amount of goods and services that each one of us is asking our planet to provide. And the result is that when you multiply this rapid growth in the number of people and this even more rapid growth in per capita GDP, you get this really extraordinary explosion of total GDP over the last several decades. And we now sit on this very vertical curve. I don't need to tell this audience that the result has really been an extraordinary transformation of our planet's natural systems. In order to feed ourselves every year, we're appropriating around 40% of the terrestrial land surface for croplands and pasture. We're using about half the accessible water, mostly to irrigate our crops. We're fishing around 90% of monitored fisheries at or well beyond the maximum sustainable yield. We've cut down huge swaths of the world's forests, dammed most of its rivers, and we're suffering with this growing problem of pollution of air, water, and soil at the same time that we're disrupting the global climate system. And so all of these kinds of changes in our natural systems are driving species extinct at about 1,000 times the baseline rate and leading to these huge reductions in the population sizes of mammals, fishes, birds, reptiles, and amphibians. And so really the core premise of planetary health is that the scale of the human enterprise now exceeds our planet's capacity to absorb our wastes or provide the resources that we're using sustainably. And as a result, collectively, our activities are transforming not just the climate system, but all of our planet's major natural systems. So we're seeing pollution of air, water, and soil. We're driving the 6th mass extinction of life on Earth. We're altering biogeochemical cycles like the carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus cycle. We're changing land use and land cover, and we're suffering from resource scarcity, things like fresh water and arable land scarcity as a result. All of these kinds of disruptions and transformations of natural systems are then interacting with each other in complex ways to affect the sort of core proximate conditions for human health and well-being: the quality of air that we breathe, the quality and quantity of food that we can produce, our exposure to infectious diseases, our exposure to extreme weather events, even the habitability of some of the places that we live. And as a result, we're increasingly seeing impacts across every dimension of human health. So just as epidemiologists have been talking for the last few decades about important cultural and social and political determinants of human health, we're coming to understand that there are critical ecological determinants, that in fact, human health is nested in a set of biophysical conditions, and that we're now changing those conditions at the steepest rates in the history of our species, with really significant impacts across different dimensions of health. My own research focuses mostly on how global environmental change affects nutritional outcomes. I've been doing work on how rising concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere actually reduces the nutritional value of the food that we eat. It lowers the amount of critical nutrients like iron and zinc and protein in staple food crops like rice and wheat and maize around the world. And we've spent the last several years modeling what those changes in the nutritional content of our foods mean in terms of the risk of micronutrient deficiencies that cause huge global burdens of disease around the world. And we're finding that around 150 to 200 million people are likely to be pushed into new risk of things like zinc and protein deficiency, just as a result of these changes in the nutrient content of the foods that we eat from adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. We've been doing a lot of work recently on pollinator declines and really trying to link together the state of insect pollinators with human health. And so we've been looking at data from Lucas Garibaldi, for example, showing that about a quarter of the yield gap in pollinator-dependent crops around the world is a result of inadequate pollination services. And then we're actually doing a modeling experiment where we say, if there had been adequate pollinators, how much of these different pollinator-dependent crops would have been produced? How would they have entered the global food trade system? Who would have ended up consuming those foods? And what would the health benefits of those consumption practices have been? And we're seeing that we're probably losing around 500,000 lives annually just from inadequate pollination services today. And we're about to start projecting some of those things forward into the future. We've been looking at ocean warming and how changes in the distribution and the sizes of fisheries around the world will affect the adequacy of nutrient intake for populations, particularly in the tropics, with fisheries moving away from the tropics and toward the poles. And we just submitted a paper last week looking at the potential of insect consumption, entomophagy, to address micronutrient deficiencies in Africa and Asia, and places where insect consumption is already sort of culturally appropriate. We're seeing these potential huge gains from the domestication of insect production as a source of protein and other micronutrients. So anyway, a whole variety of ways that changing environmental conditions or interventions can affect human health. course, these are just a few examples within the sort of domain of nutrition and environmental change. We've also been doing some work in Madagascar looking at wildlife population declines and the loss of access to bushmeat in the diet and what that is doing to nutritional sufficiency for those populations. But there are many other areas where we're not working, but that are very, very important. For example, growing water scarcity, a huge issue around land degradation, our ability to maintain crop yields, population displacement as a result of environmental change that then actually makes it much harder to achieve nutritional goals. Pollution, we know, for example, that ground level ozone pollution in the air is a significant toxin to many of our crops and reduce the yields of those crops. And then, of course, we'll continue to experience surprises as we essentially alter all of the biophysical conditions that underpin the global food production system without really fully understanding what the implications of all of those changes might be. And of course, we could make a very similar kind of diagram for every other dimension of human health that would be equally complex. So let me just very briefly try to walk you through just a few examples of that. One is front and center in our minds today, which is infectious disease. Clearly, the COVID-19 pandemic that is causing us to have this conference remotely is also a manifestation of a fundamentally risky relationship that exists between humanity and our wildlife populations. This has been sort of one of those unsurprising surprises that's been predicted for decades, that if we continue to bring together wildlife species in close proximity in ways that are essentially unnatural and then bring those species close to humanity, we'll start to see more and more of these kinds of spillover events and the emergence of new pathogens. But there are many other ways that changing environmental conditions, from the climate system to changing the biological composition of communities to things like deforestation or building dams, alter our exposure to infectious diseases in really very, very significant ways. And so there's a whole field around disease ecology that really addresses those kinds of questions. In this example, these farmers up in upland Belize have just been adding fertilizer to their maize crop. And, you know, that makes all kinds of sense. But what they don't know is that the nitrogen and the phosphate that are running off from these fields and going into small streams and then being delivered actually hundreds of miles away into lowland Belize, where they enter these wetland systems, that the addition of phosphate in particular triggers a change in the kind of typhal vegetation, these reedy vegetation types in these wetland systems, and that change in vegetation type then creates a new habitat, which is much better for a mosquito called Anopheles vestipanus than it is for the dominant mosquito that used to be in that system, Anopheles albuminus. The reason this matters to us is that Anopheles vestipanus is a much more effective malaria vector for humans. And so these upland farmers have been unwittingly increasing the exposure to malaria of their lowland compatriots by adding these nutrients into the waterways that flow into the lowland system. And in fact, in meta-analyses of these kinds of nutrient enrichment experiments, for reasons that I don't fully understand, more often than not, the addition of these nutrients tends to favor disease exposure as a result. Population displacement is another area that I'm really concerned about. We don't have fantastic data, and it's an area of active research, but what we do know is that the number of displaced people has been climbing steadily, that last year we saw record numbers of displaced people since the history of our record keeping. There were over 66 million people displaced. Over half of them were children. And there's real concern that rising sea level with more extreme storms and the loss of our coastal barrier systems like mangroves and vegetated dunes and wetlands and coral reefs, that as we're increasing the vulnerability of these coastal populations, we'll see more events where low-lying coastal populations will need to move. We're also worried about rising heat, crop failures, drought, as a driver pushing people out of places where they live. And clearly there was a a climate signal, for example, in the Syrian civil war, and then the refugee crisis that came from that. So population displacement is another area where we need to do more research, but it may have really significant impacts on human health. The non-communicable diseases in some ways are a little bit less intuitive, but there actually are very important environmental drivers to the non-communicable diseases. That first and foremost is pollution. The Pollution and Health Report that was released about a year and a half ago estimated that around 9 million deaths occur annually as a result of pollution of air, water, and soil. But there are other sort of subtler effects. For example, our research on pollinator declines or inadequate pollination services, actually a lot of the excess burden of disease from not having enough pollinators is from the non-communicable diseases, things like heart disease, stroke, diabetes, diseases that tend to be prevented by consuming things like fruits, vegetables, nuts, and seeds, which also tend to be pollinator dependent. Our work on rising CO2 also seems to suggest an impact on non-communicable diseases, because when we substitute dietary starch for dietary protein in the diet experimentally, we see an increased risk of heart disease. And yet now we're sort of doing that experiment where we're altering the stoichiometry, the amount of carbohydrate versus protein, in most of our staple food crops globally. Mental health is a final dimension of human health being affected by environmental change. Obviously, these really extraordinary disaster events that we've been seeing over the last 5 years, things like the fires in the west coast of the US or Australia or Siberia, the hurricane season we're seeing this year in the Gulf Coast, or that we saw a couple of years ago in the Caribbean, those kinds of disasters are associated with really very significant mental health effects that have been well studied. An area that hasn't been as well studied is understanding the sort of burden of disease associated with what Glenn Albrecht has called solastalgia, sort of the loss of our cherished places, and what is the burden that we carry from wondering whether our children or our grandchildren will ever see a flourishing coral reef or an elephant in the wild. What is the mental health burden associated with knowing that our own consumption practices in the wealthy parts of the world are actually putting the poorest people and future generations into harm's way. And so these are, I think, really important questions for us to understand better. But I think there are actually some pretty significant mental health burdens now from these subtler kinds of eco-anxiety that people are starting to pay more attention to. So really the point is that as we start to sort of dismantle and take apart our planet's natural systems, that the loss of that integrity of those systems is driving very, very significant global health burdens. And that's really the focus of this field of planetary health. And when we think about solutions, it really only makes sense to go way upstream and ask, well, so how do we start to reduce the total ecological footprint of humanity? So fundamentally, we clearly can't keep going in the direction we've been going, but we need to really rethink how we're living on Earth. And that's a major undertaking, obviously, but fundamentally, there's no reason to believe that our children's children can't live in a world where we've actually stabilized human population as a result of just the normal demographic transition, and educating girls and providing economic opportunities for women and access to contraception for couples who want it, where we're producing our food and our manufactured goods just with much, much more efficiency and lower ecological footprints, where we're designing our cities to optimize our physical and mental health, but to minimize our ecological footprints. And where, with every passing decade, there's actually more room, not less, for the rest of the biosphere. And fundamentally, that's going to take significant changes in how we live, how we do what we do, commitments to protecting our natural systems, and really, I think, some sort of cultural and spiritual changes around reinvigorating the reverence and the awe that most of us feel toward nature, with the kind of agency to really guide our decisions, and drawing on wisdom from lots of other traditions in the process. So I invite you all to join us at the Planetary Health Alliance. It's an organization that's been growing very quickly, actually over 220 organizations now around the world, really coming together in support of the growth of this field. We put out a monthly newsletter. We have a bunch of different sort of affinity groups within the Alliance for next-gen scholars, planetary health campus ambassadors, clinicians focusing on planetary health, women leaders in planetary health. We have a big annual meeting coming up, which will be free and online this year in April. So we welcome any and all of you to join us. And if people are interested in learning more about planetary health, we've just published a first sort of textbook for the field, which is available in Europe actually only as of the last couple of weeks, as well as in the United States. So thank you very much for your attention.